Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Addison Galambos. I apologize for the break last week, but we're back and ready to talk bonsai. This week, I have my friend Eric Forrester returning. Despite his last name, he works a lot with water engineering. So he did a previous episode with me on municipal water treatment. And that episode sparked some thoughts in our brain about what's something we could research in literature related to water and bonsai and kind of put together a conversation for folks to engage in on the podcast. So that's what we're going to be doing here today. Eric, I just wanted to say welcome and thanks for doing this crazy experiment with me.
Well, thanks for being brave enough to invite me back after last time. I like talking with you, thinking about stuff, so I'm excited to see what we get into today.
Awesome. Yeah, and for those who maybe didn't listen to the last episode, Eric does not do bonsai, but he got his degree in chemical engineering and then has worked in kind of the municipal water treatment area at a company called Calgon Carbon, who makes an activated carbon solution for the last, close to 10 years now, right, Eric? Or something around that.
Yeah, it'll be 11
We're getting
June.
Old.
Yeah, I know. That's a realization I didn't need to come to. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So he's definitely dabbled in waste treatment, and we're going to hopefully have some conversations kind of sparking both sides, the bonsai side and the water side, to come to some new conclusions. Now, that being said, neither of us are professionals in water for bonsai, so take all of this with a grain of salt. But I hope this sparks some interesting conversations, and really looking forward to what people come back to us with that we can learn from based on our kind of questions that we ask and things we run into. Awesome. So what we wanted to research for this episode was what tap water parameters are important to look at for bonsai health, and when I look at my water parameters, what may key me in that I need to do some sort of treatment plan in order to have healthy plant growth. I think, definitely in agriculture and hydroponics, the parameters, like what makes up the water that you water your tree with and thus makes it into the plant, is very, very studied and cared about. But for bonsai, we have a lot of anecdotal stories around, oh, my water's bad or my water's good, but we don't always actually look at it and determine what does good and bad mean. So I hope that makes sense to everyone, like why this question is prescient and what we're setting out to research. So Eric, I don't know. I mean, you've looked into home farming. I'm curious, as we were reading through some of these topics, did any of them kind of spark any interest for you for home gardening, or is it all too esoteric and far in the bonsai realm?
Yeah, it seems a little too heady for me at the level that we're talking about. And I am much more interested in like the animal husbandry side of like farming. Like I like chickens and goats and pigs and cows and stuff. I like taking care of the animals and doing like kind of like pseudo veterinary stuff rather than trying to grow plants. I've lost some patience as I've gotten older, which is weird. I should be gaining patience, but not to get too far down it. But I definitely, like, all of these topics are very interesting. It's just, I think the bonsai is it seems like a much more like complicated problem. Like it's in engineering, it'd be like there are a lot of different constraints on the problem, whereas in farming or like something more broad like that, and some, maybe even just soil based stuff in general, it feels, at least in my brain or like heart, it feels more like an art than a science almost. Like you can kind of play around with it and feel it, and the way that we're approaching this bonsai problem seems much more like an engineering problem that can be solved, a little bit more complicated and detailed. So
yeah,
related,
exactly.
But different.
Yeah, that's what kind of excites me. I'm not claiming to have cracked the code on water and bonsai or something like that, but my thought process is like, if I keep studying it over time and comparing that to anecdotal experiences and what I observe, then hopefully, 20 years from now, I'll have a much firmer grasp of and can advise people on water and health versus today, right? If you never try to ask these questions and you never do any experiments, then you probably aren't going to get anywhere fast, Cool. All right. So yes, we decided to research the topic of tap water and its effects on plants. So the first thing we kind of started with was in agriculture, and these are some of our assumptions. So feel free to challenge these, but I just want everyone to know like where we were coming from so that they have sources essentially for what we're doing. So when I first started reading some just like agricultural textbooks that you would get in, Ag 101 in college or something like that, they talk a lot about the 17 essential plant nutrients. I've actually seen it referred to as like 17 or 19 or 18. So there is some disagreement out there about these essential plant nutrients, but these are things like hydrogen and carbon and oxygen, which are the kind of basic nutrients. The plant mostly gets those from air and water. Then there's these primary macronutrients, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You're very familiar with those in bonsai because those are like NPK in fertilizers, right? Then there's a series of kind of secondary macro and micronutrients. This is things like magnesium and calcium and boron, etc. Right? So I thought, okay, there's hundreds of things in tap water. I need some way to narrow it down to see like which of these might actually impact or like be helpful for the plant, right? And so, that narrowed it down from 100 parameters down to 17, right? That I have from the ag study. The second thing was that kind of naturally begged the question of what concentration of these things is meaningful. Like if I have 1 part per billion of boron in my tap water, how do I know if that's a lot or a little bit, right? I can see what I have in my water, but I don't know how that relates to the plant, right? And so this was kind of an interesting problem. I'm wondering, Eric, I guess what we ultimately looked at, but did you have any thoughts on like how would we define what's meaningful for these different chemicals in terms of volume that makes it to the plant?
Well, I think one of the first things, and we'll get into it, is like one benchmark is like if you're using some sort of fertilizer solution in bonsai, to like using that as a reference point. Like they obviously think, and through testing, like that their product is effective at whatever doses that they're providing. And so using that as a reference point is probably a good place to start. And then whatever is out there, like you already did the research on what nutrients would be the most important, but seeing which ones and in what concentration they would be most important, like that's a much harder thing to tease into, I think. But
Yeah.
looking at, but to me, the interesting part was like what's meaningful to the plant versus what was meaningful to somebody like drinking water. And I know that we talked about that a little bit the last time that I was on the podcast. And that's just because my entire focus when I'm in my line of work is about like what the drinking water standards are for people drinking it. And so something that like is healthy for us and our bodily system may not be harmful, or it may be super harmful or meaningful to a bonsai plant. So I thought that little kind of crossover was very interesting.
The other thing I wanted to say is whenever I was saying some of those elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, calcium, like was there any alarm bells going off in your head when you were thinking about water treatment and like how much there may or may not be of those things and like how much of focus there is on those elements in water? You can see in our shared doc the kind of the 17 elements there if you're looking at it.
I am.
Like, what's your first thoughts from a water treatment standpoint?
Well, like things like I'll see like calcium and magnesium in like present in things like hardness, and so those are pretty common in water treatment. But things like boron or molybdenum, like there's not stuff that like they may be present, but they're not things that you're looking for all the time. And the presence of those in water, it's not always a cause for alarm, but it kind of makes you go like, why is that there? So like I would wonder about that. But though like calcium and magnesium are pretty common in water treatment. You talked about hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. Those are kind of pretty common no matter what field you're in. But to me, the couple that stand out are chlorine, because that's a very common disinfectant in water treatment. To like as the water travels through the pipes in the distribution system, you got to make sure that bacteria don't grow or feed on any organic material that might still be left in the water or in the pipe as it's traveling to your house. So you need to disinfect that water so you don't get, typhus drinking your tap water. And so chlorine, like that to me, that's an interesting one. Is like it's common. It's in almost everybody's water in some amount, whether you can smell it or not. When it gets that like swimming pool type odor and taste, that might be up for debate. But it's in everybody's water, and so seeing whether that makes a real impact on a bonsai plant or not, to me is like that's like an immediately interesting.
Very cool. And then nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. how common are you going to see those in our tap water?
I mean, you'd see it. You're not going to want to see that in your tap water. Like you might see it in like a wastewater plant's influent, especially near like an agricultural area where there's a lot of runoff into that water source going to like the stormwater sewer or something like that. But generally, those things, because they're NPK, it's a very big thing in fertilizer. It's going to want to promote growth, and that's kind of what you don't want in the distribution part of the water system. You're not trying to promote the growth of organisms. You want to get those organisms out of the water, and so you're not going to see those. Well, they're in the water. They're present. Things are present with nitrogen, with phosphorus. They're in potassium. There are organic molecules that have those elements in them, but they're not things that we're intentionally adding to the water. We're trying to get them out for the most part.
Makes sense. So the other thing that stood out to me when I learned about these 17 essential nutrients was almost none of these are available or exist in plant available forms in the soil. So, we have to supplement either by our tap water or by fertilizer. We'll figure out which in the rest of the episode here, but you have to supplement those things to the bonsai. So it just underscored for me, like, if these nutrients are so essential, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, that'll come from air and water. But all the other primary macronutrients and micronutrients, we have to give them to the plant in some way if we want it to grow vigorously and healthily, assuming these are like required things, right? Which is an assumption that we're making at this phase. Cool. We found that these are the nutrients we might want to focus on. I think the gap maybe is that we don't know which nutrients or like which elements may be harmful to the plant, like it doesn't need, that actively hurt it, right? That might be an area for further study. Looking at some of these micronutrients and seeing like at which level they're actually harmful to the plant, if they're too macro, in terms of volume, or what other elements in tap water could be dangerous. So, that's kind of a further area of study, I think. But we could only look at so many elements here in this first episode. Agreed. So, like you mentioned, we saw these elements, and then we wanted to find out we need some initial benchmark to tell us like what's actually meaningful in terms of amounts of these different elements. So, the first thought that came to our mind is, hey, we use fertilizer all the time on plants, on bonsai, and that fertilizer is effective, right? We see that in the plant growth, but without fertilizer and with fertilizer. So the concentrations that we're using to water the plant with must be meaningful, right? And so one thing I wanted to pull out and just use as a gauge, I'm not saying these are the optimal ratios or something like that, but just to like give us a finger in the wind kind of benchmark is for liquid soluble inorganic fertilizers, what actual concentration of these different elements are they feeding to the plant? And so I actually did two different fertilizers, but I'll talk about Miracle-Gro here first because we're all very familiar with that. So, I had Miracle-Gro at my house, and on the package it lists the components, right? It says, hey, 15% nitrogen and 20% phosphorus, etc., right? And then on the package, it gives you a instruction for how much to use, right? It says, hey, every 2 weeks, water with 1 gallon of water mixed with, 2 grams of Miracle-Gro concentrate, right? So you take your little measuring spoon and you dish in, a teaspoon, or you weigh the amount that you're going to put into the water, and then you mix it up and then you water the plant, right? And the idea is that those elements are available in a form that is available to the plant, and maybe they get bound to the soil particles, or maybe they just touch the roots whenever the soil's saturated and get sucked up. That's kind of that's out of scope for right now, but those amounts are meaningful, right? And so let me just read out to you, for a normal Miracle-Gro mixture, I calculated that the package instructions have you mixing up your fertilizer at about 3,000 parts per million for the solution. So when you're fertilizing every 2 weeks, and then if you kind of divide that by 14 days, then you get about 223, parts per million total dissolved solids per day from fertilizer, right? If you were to say like microdose it at the daily value instead of macrodose it every 2 weeks, right? So 3,000 ppm versus around 200 ppm. So just right off the bat, what's your initial take on that, Eric, against the kind of, Eric did some research on different water reports. So I'm just curious on like hearing that number. What does that spark for you based on what you know about the total dissolved solids in tap water?
Well, that depending on the water source, that could be a little bit, or it could be a lot. Um, the TDS can vary a lot by geography. I'd say in some of what I would, if I were looking at it through my drinking water scope, what I would call cleaner water sources, that would be a lot of TDS. And we'll see when we start getting into the data, there were maybe 2 or 3 that were about an order of magnitude lower than that, like maybe 1/10 of that value, or in that kind of ballpark. But then there were a couple other ones that were 2 or 3 times that total amount of TDS in their water source. And you'll see they're from different parts of the country, and so that can play a role as just naturally where they're drawing the water from, whether it's a well, some sort of groundwater source, or a surface water like reservoir or river, lake, something like that. But for a cleaner water source, that seems like that's a pretty good chunk. To me, it was really interesting the way that you broke that down, going from the highly concentrated solution to kind of doing an analogy of what it would be over 14 days. Because to me, it seems like there are different mechanisms for uptake that would be competing, when you have like a higher concentration versus a lower concentration. And so I wonder if you can make that, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I wonder aloud whether you can make that little break it down to the daily level, like whether you can make that just linear, like arithmetic mean and go like that, or if there's some other,
to determine that 200 is meaningful. Yeah, I think that is a gap, right? And I think what you're saying is like, hey, maybe they say do it every 2 weeks at this really high concentration because that's what actually adds the osmotic pressure that gets the nutrients into the plant, or we'd have to study the actual mechanics of how the nutrients get into the root, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my thought is dosing of fertilizer, I have been doing that for the last 2 years and it's been fairly effective. So that's kind of why I made that intuitive leap to break it down from the every 2 weeks value and concentration to the daily kind of broken out value, because that's what I've been doing in my garden and I've seen good results. So I think to me that would say obviously this is a small case study, but to me that would say that whatever mechanism of fertilizer getting into the plant is effective whether you do it every 2 weeks or at a 1 divided by 14 kind of ratio for every day at a smaller amount, right? So maybe the nutrients get bound to the soil particles, the cation exchange sites, and then they're taken up by the plant over time. And so you're kind of refilling those a little bit every day. Or, maybe just maybe more nutrients are absorbed at once whenever you do this really high concentration. I don't claim to know the details of that, but I do think it's fairly, I do feel it's fairly safe that microdosing fertilizer can be just as effective as kind of macrodosing it.
Yeah, you have more direct experience than I do. But yeah, that was that's where my head was like, oh, it's a, mass diffusion. Like you have a high concentration, it's going to want to, high to low, it's going to want to, force more material into the low concentration
within
gradient.
The plant.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was my thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we're going to have to do another episode, it looks like, on kind of the actual physical phenomenon of how salt stress and these different pressure and concentration differentials impact kind of absorption into the plant. I know that's a pretty complex topic, so we'll see. Maybe I won't sign up for that just yet. But so one other thing I wanted to call out. So we talked about the TDS being about 3,000 whenever it was just a 1 drop. The other fertilizer I looked at was about 2,500, 400, I believe, parts per million total dissolved solids. Maybe I should define those terms. I'll do that in a second here. But the other thing is just kind of breaking out the elements. These fertilizers are just kind of some of the things that I noticed that was interesting. So the macronutrients, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they were at a concentration of about 750 parts per million, 250 parts per million, and 500 parts per million, respectively. So that 3,000 TDS, parts per million TDS, Like those are the subcomponents. The majority of it is these macronutrients, right? And
Yeah,
then
like half,
just
right?
yes,
That's like close
yes,
to half. Okay.
exactly. The components are when you read the package, right? Like it'll add up all the percentages, right? But they'll only add up to about 50% because there's other nutrients that are like the byproducts of what these elements are paired with, right?
Oh yeah.
That aren't listed on the package, right? So 750 parts per million is of nitrogen, the element nitrogen, but nitrogen is available as like urea or nitrates or
Yeah.
whatever it is, whatever
Okay.
form it is, right? So there's like when you look at the weight of the solution, the bulk density, about half of it is actually the elements that you want going into the plant versus other things. And that can probably vary based on the fertilizer and like what kind of molecules they're using, right? So just a quick kind of taking us one step back. When I say concentration in parts per million, I'm talking about grams per liter or, whatever the imperial of that would be. What is it? It's volume for non-metric.
You,
It's like pounds per square foot or cubic foot or
cubic
whatever,
foot.
right?
There it is.
Sorry. my
LBCF.
my metric is showing. Okay, so we see that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are there in like pretty high concentrations. This is the every 2 week kind of mix.
Yes.
Boron,
The
copper,
3000.
iron, they're all really, really low. So nitrogen is 750 parts per million. Boron is 0.625 parts per million. So, we're talking like thousands and thousands of, 1,000-time difference
Yeah.
between the concentrations, right? So there's definitely a big difference between what the plant needs as a primary nutrient and a micronutrient.
Yes.
The,
That
the
makes
other
me.
thing,
That just. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that that just makes me curious. Like, what are each of these? Like, what is the function of each of these in the plant?
Yeah.
And like, that's like my novice bonsai, my ignorance showing. But it's like, oh wow, like, how could a plant need 1,000th of this compared to like one of something else? Like, that's wild to think.
Yes. Yeah. It is pretty cool. I don't know. That's a great question. Like, I don't know what function boron plays in the plant. There is a lot of research on that. So that might be something to get into in the future, right? But, like I know, for example, one example is iron. Sometimes we'll see in bonsai trees that they're really yellow and there's like chlorosis. So the people will recommend like, oh, you need to have more iron getting into the plant. And so to like combat that yellowing of the leaves, right? So there must be something related to chlorophyll that is related to iron, for example, right? I don't know the details, but that's just kind of an example of like some process in chlorophyll production or chlorophyll health. I don't know, but it is related to iron, I would assume, right?
Okay,
So,
is that so? Is that like chlorosis? Is that like just a breakdown of chlorophyll in the plant? Like,
that's a
I'm
great
trying to use
question.
my I'm trying to use my human phys like Latin root word things like ice,
Yes,
like
chlorosis
is
is when a plant
inflammation of
turns
some
pale
sort.
yellow and creates insufficient chlorophyll. So, iron must be important, apparently, in chlorophyll production, right? So there must be
Huh.
some biological process that, again, I'm not an expert on this, but that's just like one example that I've heard of before.
Well, thank you. I'm marginally more intelligent now.
You've achieved super intelligence with that small
Well,
bump. No, I'm
let's
just
not
kidding.
get.
So the other thing that really stood out to me is there was no magnesium or calcium in bonsai. In Miracle Grow.
That's strange.
That
Yeah.
yeah, that was really. I was like, whoa. These are secondary macronutrients, so they're probably needed in a concentration that's less than nitrogen but more than boron, for example, right? I don't know what concentration they're needed at, but let's say it's like 100 parts per million, right? Or something like that for calcium. But the plant isn't getting that from fertilizer, potentially, and it's also not getting it from the soil because there's not, I mean, our soils, A, like most of the stuff is not accessible and then to the plant, and B, like there's not massive amounts of calcium. Akadama maybe has some, but it's not a massive amount, right? So that instantly sent an alarm bell for me. Like, where's the calcium and magnesium coming from?
Yeah. And the sulfur's not in there either.
Yeah,
And then
correct.
that's interesting. And I wonder if that's, I mean, obviously I believe, like, I have to believe it's an intentional choice by the manufacturer of the fertilizer. And so that might lead into what we talk about when we look at the data, and like maybe it's because calcium and magnesium are very commonly occurring in water. They make up a bulk of hardness. That's a very common thing. It's really an aesthetic parameter. It's not being treated for any sort of like health or wellness or like illness sort of reason. And so maybe they're making the assumption that we don't need to add that in there because the plant is going to get it, because the water is going to naturally have calcium and magnesium in amounts that are meaningful to the plant pretty much everywhere.
Totally. So I think that segues very nicely into, all right, we found out like some data on what might be meaningful amounts of these chemicals. Let's now look at our water parameters. So I'd love you to take me through maybe a definition of the different parameters that we decided to watch, and then talk to me through what concentrations they were available at in these different waters, and then talk to me about how you got the parameters. Well, maybe let's start with one of those. Why don't you talk to me first about, like, I tasked you with looking into getting the water parameters for a number of different municipalities. How did you approach that problem?
Well, all of these municipalities, they have to publish a water quality report. I believe it's every year. There are certain parameters that they have to test for to make sure that they're meeting all the health and safety standards, and there are other parameters that are more aesthetic, or they only test them in certain areas because they know that they only occur in certain areas. So not every utility is going to test for the same things all the time. But basically, you can go to your local utility's website or call them up if you don't know where you're having trouble finding. You can get their water quality report for the year. And so you were very helpful and gave me a lovely list of something like 8 or 9 different places. And the parameters that we decided to focus on were total dissolved solids, TDS, which you can kind of roughly think of as like kind of electrolytes, like stuff that's dissolved in the water. The name kind of spells it out more or less. Alkalinity, which from another chart is kind of like the basic or non-acidic this stuff is, kind of a buffering capacity, the ability to neutralize acids in the water, the pH of the water, and then the concentration of calcium and magnesium. And so the first thing that I'll say before even I list off what utilities that we're looking at is that 3 of the 8 didn't have any of that information available on their water quality report at all. One of them had TDS, but none of the other 4 parameters. And so, like you had alluded to earlier, is that, and what I had started saying is that not every utility is going to measure for the same things. They all have the same sort of required, hey, this is a regulation federally, you have to make sure that the water is producing less than this amount of chemical X, or, whatever it is. But not all of them are going to test for the same sort of secondary contaminants. And you see that in these data. But some of them have like a more complete data set, and you can kind of see some more meaningful trends, or start making some assumptions about what's good and what's bad.
Yeah. I wanted to make 2 points on that. So if I'm hobbyist X and I live in county Y, and I look at my county's report and it doesn't have any of these values, one thing that I have done in the past is I actually emailed the county or the municipality, the water plant, and they actually can get you some of these parameters still. They looked at me funny, they gave me but they do measure these things, and they can sometimes share this information with you. So don't lose hope.
Great
like
point.
Step 1, email, go a little deeper, like email, this company or the water treatment facility and ask if they can get you some of these parameters if you're interested. And then the second thing is, like, how difficult is it to test these things on your own water? Like the parameters that we pulled out in your experience.
That's a great question. And you might actually be able to answer that a little better than me, just with your experience with Bonsai. Because as an engineer, I wasn't behind the bench as much. I was more behind the phone or on the computer. And so I wasn't out in the field trying to test a lot of these things. But stuff like pH, like they're very, like anybody with any sort of pool, like a lot of pool treatment stores or any sort of like hot tub store, like they'll have a lot of very helpful, like basic chemistry things like pH meters or stuff to measure TDS and alkalinity kind of on the cheap and on the simple. They're kind of in my opinion, they'd be a good first stop for kind of a lot of this basic water chemistry stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, the majority of my water testing experience comes from the freshwater and saltwater hobby industry. And there's lots of like very high accuracy, like very like the same processes that we used in in chem lab in college. They had the exact same kind of accuracy and fidelity. So for TDS, for example, you can get very slow costs, like $10 meters on Amazon that work really well, at least for the kind of the level of accuracy that we need for our hobby. Like you said, pH, there's a lot of like chemical, like titration type, like you're doing a little chem lab to test it, but you can also just buy a pH meter. If you are going to buy a pH meter, it might be, $40 to $50, but you also need to buy a calibration solution. So just keep that in mind. That is a requirement for being able to use these with any kind of accuracy or trust.
Yes.
The next thing, alkalinity. Alkalinity is something you test a ton in the hobby, for the fish keeping hobby. So alkalinity, there's a lot of really good tests out there. Most of them are of the like the chemistry lab variety, where you're like adding drops to a solution and checking the color versus like a digital meter. But be careful when you're testing alkalinity. You have to get alkalinity kits for freshwater as opposed to for saltwater, because the kind of chemical components they use are different and they won't be accurate. Like the alkalinity and hardness in saltwater, it's just full of salt. So there's like thousands and thousands of TDS, right? Versus with freshwater, you might be in the, 100 TDS range. And so they're orders of magnitude different and they use different chemicals. Magnesium is another one that's testable. I'm not 100% sure on calcium. I'll have to look more into that one. But of those parameters, you could probably buy a full test suite that will last you for, years with, I don't know, maybe $100 total. So definitely doable if you want to test these things yourself, or you can always send them out to labs. There's various labs that'll test water for you. You can look them up online.
One final point that I want to make is just because you had mentioned you would email to get more information from your local water utility. And just because I've worked with a lot of municipal governments, I would say I want to emphasize that point and encourage the listeners to like not be afraid to do that. Because a lot of these people, they don't get a lot of interaction with like their constituents, I'll call them, on a daily basis. And when they do, it's usually negative. It's usually negative feedback. So if you call with a curious, honest question, most times they're going to love that. And they will be very helpful and willing to go above and beyond for you. And so just on a human level, I want to encourage that behavior. That's a good thing. So feel free to do that.
Yeah, whenever I emailed them, I said they kind of looked at me funny, but they really pulled out all the stops. The guy was, the person who got the email was like, oh, I don't know, but I'll put you in touch with our lead engineer at the, blah, blah, blah site. And, then he got roped in, and then they were having a discussion of like, where can we get these? And they got it all for me. So it's really helpful. So I agree that it seemed like they were very enthusiastic about helping. So I love that you called that out.
Good stuff.
All right. So talk to us a little bit about these regions that you looked at. And I got these regions I put out a little survey of like online on some different forums for Bonsai. And I said, hey, please send me your municipality and then whether it's a good or bad water in your experience, right? So very anecdotal, but I just wanted to see like, could we look at these different municipalities and draw some, broad strokes findings from these different reports? I would have loved to have gotten more reports, like if more people had submitted their water reports. So if anybody listening can provide that, say like, hey, I live in municipality of, for example, for me, it's San Francisco, and I use the San Francisco public water utility, and I think my water is good, right? If anybody can share those things with me on Instagram or comments on the podcast, I'd love to add those to the study and make it a little bit more official, but we did with what we had. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the parameters, Eric?
Okay, so like I said, the 5 parameters that we kind of just put into a table for these different utilities were total resolved solids, TDS, alkalinity, pH, calcium, and magnesium. And so I think I'll go through like I said, 3 of these, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 3 of the 9 didn't have any of those parameters listed on their water quality report. Like we said, they almost certainly have those data and you can ask them about it. But the ones that we do have were in various completeness are San Francisco, San Jose, San Luis Obispo, East Bay Mud, Phoenix, Arizona, and Suffolk County, New York, which is on Long Island. And so a lot of this is in the west or southwest, with a little bit of an outlier in the northeast with Long Island. Some of the other utilities that we had didn't have these particular parameters. They had other helpful data, but there were a couple in the Midwest, Ohio and Minnesota, and then one more on the west in Oregon. But I think for the purposes of going through, and I think it'd be useful to compare, I think, two sets of two. Like San Francisco and East Bay Mud look fairly similar to me in their results. And then San Luis Obispo and Phoenix, Arizona are also like strikingly similar. And I think they're kind of bookends of this kind of spectrum of results that highlight what we were talking about earlier of varying from region to region.
Yeah, spoiler, you also have split them by ones that were anecdotally good and anecdotally bad. So I think that, you know,
victory.
You got to choose which is which. But yeah, okay, go ahead. Very curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think you've spoiled it for me because you've told me what you think of your water before. So, we'll start with San Francisco and East Bay Mud, which I think is also in like the eastern part of the bay
that's
of San Francisco.
the Oakland.
Yeah,
different water sources, but yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I imagined that they would be drawing from the same places, otherwise they'd be the same utility. Anyway, TDS San Francisco is at 102 ppm on average, milligrams per liter, and then East Bay Mud, which is municipal utility district, is 65 ppm. So pretty comparable, not terribly far apart. You might look at them just kind of like, oh wow, 65 and 102. They're kind of, that's nearly 50% apart, lower or whatever. But if then we just look briefly at San Luis Obispo and Phoenix, they had somewhere between 500 and 700 ppm of TDS, so wildly different, orders of magnitude higher than San Francisco and East Bay Mud. So now you can see why I grouped them the way that I did.
Yeah.
You see something similar.
Yeah, 10x difference between those two.
Yeah.
Right. And then what I think is really striking is you compare that to the kind of fertilizer concentrations and the daily amount. You're watering daily or sometimes multiple times a day, and both could potentially be significant, but that San Luis Obispo and Phoenix water is 2 to 3 times more than the daily concentration of microdosing fertilizer, right? So to me, it stands out that like, hey, that is either A, competing with fertilizer for uptake in the plant, and it's having an impact on the chemistry of the soil and the environment of the roots. So
agreed.
Initial thought there.
I completely agree. That makes perfect sense. The competition, when you have a concentration that's just that high in the water, like it's just whether the fertilizer is then meaningful in that kind of concentration environment is like, it's definitely degraded the importance.
Yeah, that's a good call out. I wanted to double click on that. So for example, whenever I microdose fertilizer, I'm adding 200 parts per million of fertilizer, and then let's say my water is 100 naturally. So I've now made a mixture of 300 parts per million and aggregate, and 2/3 of that is fertilizer. If you add 200 parts per million to your, San Luis Obispo water, you're going from maybe 700 parts per million to 900 parts per million. Like, let's say, just to make the math easy, let's say, from 800 to 1,000, then you're only 20% fertilizer and you're 80% non-fertilizer, right? Versus 66% fertilizer and 33% non-fertilizer. So, just the basics of kind of reaction kinetics, like let's say each, we get 200 chances at, the root uptaking a molecule. It has a 66% chance of one of those interactions being an interaction with fertilizer versus a 20% chance of one of those molecules being fertilizer. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, right? But
yeah,
that's just roughly there's only a certain amount of interactions that the can engender with the roots. And so making sure that those count and they're actually stuff that the plant wants, I think is important.
I completely agree. And then just like thinking as you're talking about that, I'm just thinking that like, okay, the fertilizer is in some sort of proportion. Like it's the N, P, and K and all the other nutrients are in a proportion that is like supposed to be ideal. Like they're in the proportions they are for a reason. And when you add it to like the lower TDS water, that those proportions are maintained or they're less disrupted. But then you put it into that much bigger soup. Now they're diluted so far that they hardly mean anything. It's really, yeah, it's really easy to see the impact when you have a 3-digit number right next to a 2-digit number to see like, yeah, it's not going to go how you want it.
Makes sense. Sorry, I keep interrupting. I just, these things
Not
are
at
popping
all.
out to me and very interesting.
Now the next one, alkalinity is a little bit more subtle, I think, because you see with San Luis Obispo and Phoenix that the results are kind of noticeably elevated. We'll say at 94 to 107 ppm with San Luis Obispo and 115 all the way up to 234 with Phoenix. And the reason for that range is they have different sampling locations in their distribution network. And so they were listing the annual average at multiple different locations in their water report. And so I was kind of listing the high and low of those annual averages. And so then San Francisco just had one annual average and it was at 60. So much lower than the San Luis Obispo and the Phoenix levels. And then East Bay Mud, they similarly had many different sampling points, but their low sampling point was down at 20, which is similar to the San Francisco level. But then their high number was up at 140. So in the San Luis Obispo and Phoenix kind of realm, if we're kind of breaking them apart in these little buckets here. So it was interesting, and it highlights like you can get different results here depending on where you are, even in the same utilities distribution.
Totally. And I think that's another important thing to call out is that these are guidelines. They're taken maybe at one time in the year, for example, and water quality can vary pretty heavily throughout the year. You're not going to always see your values pinned to these exact amounts. There's seasonal shifts, like you talked about last episode, where reservoirs run dry and they come from different sources, or you shift from a reservoir to groundwater throughout the year, right, based on snow melt and stuff. So these parameters are going to change, and they might be different for your actual what's coming out of your tap versus what was tested way upstream from where you're at. So I think it is important to test some of these to spot check against this report, kind of as at your own home where they could be different.
Agreed. Always get the best data is, the stuff that's closest to where you're going to be using that water.
So on alkalinity, why don't you do pH first, and then let's talk about alkalinity and pH again, because this is something that's really fascinated me.
Now this one is interesting because East Bay Mud didn't have like an average pH listed. Phoenix, Arizona was 7.3 to 8.3, which is pretty where I'd kind of expect it. I'd expect it to be pretty neutral and erring on the side of a little bit basic. San Luis Obispo, they had a very narrow range of pH, which I was kind of surprised with because I've seen pH can swing sort of wildly. It can be kind of finicky. But 7.36 to 7.47 is what they had reported, so a very narrow. And then San Francisco just had a pH of 9.3 listed on their report. Which, like, in my head, like, I more often see in drinking water treatment water that is slightly basic, slightly alkaline than acidic. And I think in my head it's to prevent, like, corrosion in the pipes. Like, I'd be interested to see what the LSI, the Langley or saturation index for these were. Because I think you'd want the pipe to grow scale slightly rather than corrode slightly. You don't want scale to form in the pipe because then it's going to get plugged up and there's going to be a whole nother sorts of issues. But if I had to put a reason around like why is on all of these pHs that I was seeing, like nothing was below 7. Like there is no acidic pH that you're going to see. And if I had to rationalize it, that would be how, is that it's like we don't want to corrode the pipes. We'd rather scale them than corrode them. And I think you'd be more likely to corrode in an acidic pH than at a basic.
Yeah. That makes sense. I thought the variability of these was very interesting. It wasn't as clear of a like, oh, the alkalinity was twice the alkalinity of the good waters, or the TDS was, 10 times higher. This one, it was like, it kind of felt like a scatter shot, right? Where the water
Mm-hmm.
reports were scattered around. For Suffolk, I know Suffolk County wasn't one of your kind of ones that you called out because we didn't have every parameter, but the pH there was 7 to 7.5, right? And that's good water anecdotally in
Yes.
comparison to San Francisco, which is 9.3. So, okay, I want to dive a little bit into this. So, talk to me a little bit about alkalinity and like what buffering means.
So, and this was a topic that we talked about a little bit on the last episode, I think. But it's the ability to neutralize acids. Like in a couple of different graphics that I've seen, it's really like this is a kind of a like an analog for this is the presence of hydroxyl groups, minus groups. And so it's not just a buffering capacity like in general. It's not a resistance to pH swing like in either direction necessarily. It's specifically the capacity to buffer like acids in water. And so it does have an impact on pH, like pH, alkalinity, and TDS really. They're all related. They can all like kind of correlate with each other, but they're measuring different things.
Makes sense. So, yeah, what is the difference between, having a high pH and having a high buffering capacity for your pH in your water? So having a high alkalinity versus having a high pH.
Right. So like having a high pH means that the water is basically the opposite of acidic, and some people will refer to that as alkaline, which is where you can get confused with alkalinity or the ability to buffer acids. And so if you have a high pH, it could be that the water is, we'll call it sensitive, or just in my layman's parlance, and that if you added an acid to it, like hydrochloric acid to that water, it could rapidly swing that pH to make it lower. Like the water might not have hardly anything else in it except water, but its pH is elevated. So then when you add the presence of something else, it will dramatically swing the pH. And so it's not resistant to changing pH. Whereas if you had a high pH water that also had high alkalinity, it's going to have a higher buffering capacity. So if the pH is at 9 and then you dump acid in, you're going to need to put a whole lot more acid into the water to get it to change the same amount, the same number of pH units as you would have before in our sensitive water example.
Makes sense. So this is a parameter. These set of parameters I think are very important because there's this often cited research similar to the essential nutrients. This is kind of like a foundation of agricultural textbooks that nutrient uptake for those 17 essential nutrients is dependent on pH. And, our pH of our water is going to have a impact on the water plus soil solution, right? The pH has a soil, the water has a pH. The soil has a pH, the water has a pH. When you combine them, they have a new pH, right? Based on, those two things fighting, the buffering capacity of the soil, the buffering capacity of the water, right? And they have a tug of war and they end up somewhere in the middle, right? Or on one side or the other if one has a really strong buffering capacity, right? Or has low ability to influence the other. So basically, I don't know the exact details, but there's kind of this citation of like, in the 6 to 6.5 range of pH, it's like slightly acidic value that, it optimizes the most nutrients for uptake for the plant, right? Nutrients can be taken up, at higher pHs or lower pHs, but you might have less of a balance of what the plant needs, right? I think it's a little bit of that's a hard thing to prove, I feel like. So I take that with a grain of salt, but, I do think that solubility of different things at different pHs is very well understood. And so I could understand that these things are available to the plant in different concentrations as the pH changes. The other thing that's kind of telling is Akadama has a pH around 6. Potentially, if that's a good soil component and it seems to work well for a majority of our bonsai trees, then, the soil pH is probably, it seems to me if like you were testing a bunch of different soils over time, if you were aligned on one that was good, it probably would have conditions that are good for root and plant development, right? So if we accept that Akadama is a good soil component, then we can look at the pH of Akadama and kind of, that can tell us something of like, hey, maybe that's a good pH for us to want the soil solution to be at, right? That's a little bit fluffy, but that's just kind of an observation, I guess, right? Would use further for testing. And that was gained both, that pH for Akadama was both through my own testing as well as from literature. So that's not like a made up thing.
I believe you. I was gonna say I don't need to get into necessarily the whole history of how Akadama became this ubiquitous thing in bonsai, and we can just kind of leave it as it worked, so like we kept it, and that is like that. There is wisdom there. There can be like things to be learned from that. If something does work and it works for a long time, then there probably, like you said, it's likely to have attributes that are favorable to whatever you're dealing with. But it could also be like, oh well, some guy was really good at saying the name Akadama or whatever, and so then it just got in there and everybody's used it ever since.
Yeah.
So like I'm not trying
I
to
think,
assert that necessarily, but it was
yeah,
an interesting thought.
in general, bonsai is practiced or kind of has been refined in Japan, and they have a lot of Akadama there, and it's cheap, so that was why, probably. It's used amongst other components, mostly like lava related, kind of volcanic soils, and all of them have, I'd say, fairly low buffering capacity relative to like organic soil, are in that lower pH range. So it's not to say that that's the only thing that you can grow plants in, right? Or bonsai in even, but that's where it came from in the short version, I guess, and some of the physical properties of it. So the reason I think this is interesting to look at is because a lot of times people will treat their water with acid to get it to a lower pH. And I'm not as convinced that that's ultra effective. I think if you have high alkalinity, it could be like you might need to. So the first thing I want to call out is like, if you have high alkalinity, so here we're defining high alkalinity in the like 100 plus range, I guess, parts per million.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The alkalinity, like the main molecule contributing to alkalinity, usually in US tap water at least, is calcium carbonate. So essentially like agricultural limestone from the soil that's crushed and comes from groundwater and is in your soil or water. So it's not really a contaminant from drinking water, from what you've explained before, but it does affect the pH. So in agriculture, in the fields, they'll use lime to raise the pH of very acidic soils. So whenever you're watering with high alkalinity water, you are adjusting your soil chemistry over time. Every time you water, there's some more calcium carbonate being added to the soil, and it's raising the pH over time. So if you have high alkalinity, to me, that might be an indicator that you need to either acidify the water and reduce the pH, and destroy those carbonate ions molecules that contribute to the kind of higher pH, or you need to kind of strip down your water, right, and remove those alkaline components. So this was interesting to me, seeing these different alkalinity levels, because we can see that the ones that were kind of denoted as good, there was still alkalinity. There was still calcium in the calcium carbonate, and then thus like calcium, a calcium source for the plant in the water. And it was kind of in that like 60 to 80 range versus 100 plus in the kind of ones that were deemed bad water, right? So there was a combination of high alkalinity, lots of calcium carbonate, as well as high TDS in the bad water. And there was lower alkalinity, so less buffering capacity, less impact on your soil pH over time, but still enough calcium and magnesium to provide those nutrients to the plant. The other thing I wanted to mention was, maybe I'm going on a crusade here, but like I have high pH water in San Francisco, like that 9.3. I've tested it before with my pH meter and I get like 8.6, I get high pHs, right? The reason I'm not as worried about that is because my alkalinity is fairly low. So the buffering capacity of the soil, as well as whenever you mix in fertilizer to your water, fertilizer is almost always acidic. And so that's going to adjust the pH. I don't acidify my water when I have a low TDS, low alkalinity solution, a tap water. I just add fertilizer, which reduces the pH, and I just go about my day. I think people have a tendency to like over acidify, like start adding sulfuric acid, or sometimes they use these like organic acids, which actually re-release the carbonates back into the soil over time, and it can increase the pH over time actually instead of decreasing it. And so I just wanted to call that out as a caution. Like if you're acidifying your water, I mean, maybe it's worked really well for you, right? But it's just something to be careful of what acid you're using. Like they use specific ones in the agricultural industry, and then be careful of why you're doing it, right? So those are the two things I wanted to call out.
Do you think people have like a penchant to want to acidify their water? Like, or at least that's my impression based on how you were talking, is that people kind of like, it's a very common thing. It seems almost like a natural, like I want to do that, but it may be
totally.
like
I think that's
counterintuitive.
probably the most common thing that people do if they're treating their water at all. It's acidifying it. They're mixing in some acetic acid or something like that in like an injector system. I mean, I think it all comes from like maybe they're noticing chlorosis in their plant, like they're noticing this lack of iron. And iron, for example, is one of the nutrients that is supposed to have lower, like at high pHs has lower solubility. So I think people see that and they go, okay, I want to reduce my pH, so I'm going to use these acids, right? Acidify it. And, that works. Like their pH goes from 7.5 or 9.3 or whatever down to 6.5 and they water, right? But I think that that can often, I think it's not as effective as folks, or not as important as folks think. They actually might be, if they're adding fertilizer also, then they might even be bringing their pH down even farther below that 6.5 range. They might be in the 5.5 range or something like that. So you just have to be aware of what you're doing. The other thing is you have to be careful of what type of acid you're using. I think people use organic acids a lot, which actually like temporarily reduce the pH. Acetic acid, carbonic acid, or I guess not carbonic acid, but acetic acid, which then forms carbonates. There's two other organic acids. Citric acid, yes, exactly. Citric acid or acetic acid, I think, are used sometimes. And from what I've read, at least, they're not used in ag because they can result in actually increasing the pH over time when combined with calcium carbonates that you have in water. Like the reaction that you do, like eventually ends up precipitating back out because those acids aren't stable. Bacteria feed on the organic components and then re-release the carbonates. And then people usually use, I think, in ag, phosphoric acid or sulfuric acid. There's one other that's very common too, but those are the ones that I would recommend based on what I've read in ag if you do need to acidify your water.
Gotcha.
But the thing that strikes me is that often this high buffering capacity, this high alkalinity, this high buffering capacity, like to me, the buffering capacity is more important than the actual pH, right? If the buffering capacity is really low, then when you water, your soil and your fertilizer will overpower the buffering capacity, and you actually have acidic, like right in that range that you want to be in, right? Versus not. I think people get obsessed with that range of like 6.5 pH. And so I've never acidified my water, so I could be totally off on this. I'm really curious to hear people's thoughts. But my initial thought is like, if you're going to acidify, it's probably in the scenario where you have this really high buffering capacity, and you might actually be better served by totally stripping out your stuff from your water because you have really high TDS. Whenever you add acid, it actually doesn't reduce the total dissolved solids in the water, right? You're adding solids to the water. You're adding solutes, right? You're adding ions. So if you acidify your San Luis Obispo water, you're going from 700 TDS to 800 TDS, or I'm making that up, but like you're increasing it, right? And so you might have a better pH, but you still have the problem of there's a bunch of crap in your water that the plant doesn't need. That's my soapbox or my like hypothesis here.
Seems reasonable to me.
So let's round it out on the water parameters with calcium and magnesium.
All right. So Phoenix does not have values for either calcium or magnesium, so unfortunately they get left out of this last little debate here. But looking at the two Bay Area utilities, San Francisco had calcium at 15 and magnesium at 5.7. East Bay Mud had a calcium range of somewhere from 5 to 34. And so that's pretty in line with San Francisco being right in the middle of that range there. East Bay Mud did not have a magnesium value reported. San Luis Obispo, on the other hand, with calcium was, as opposed to 5 to 15 or 34, it was 85 to 110 was the range that they had reported. But then magnesium was much lower, very similar to San Francisco, actually, at 6.4 to 8.9, all ppm.
Mm.
But it is very interesting to see the calcium being so much higher, especially when you see the TDS and the alkalinity also higher than the other two that we're looking at, San Francisco and East Bay mud. So that, to me, that stands to reason that at least a big part of the TDS would be the calcium or other hardness present in the water.
Yeah. I wonder how the water report's a little bit confusing to me because they pull out calcium as its own component, but then they report alkalinity as calcium carbonate. So
yes,
I don't fully understand the relationship between calcium in the report and alkalinity.
Yeah, I don't really know how they're
Are there just
measuring like
other
elemental.
non-calcium?
Yeah, like I don't get how they're doing that elemental analysis exactly. And the shame on me, the water engineer, knowing that. But yeah, it does create confusion when you're looking at the water report, because then again you could look at something else that isn't in the table that we're both staring at very intently, but like hardness is also reported in units of like calcium based hardness, and so there are these three different parameters that mean three different things, but they're all saying like this is some level of calcium. Like that's going to cause confusion.
Yeah, they should all be correlated, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Maybe so. Something anecdotal I wanted to share on this was I read a study that was talking about hydroponics, and they dose with calcium of these hydroponic grow systems. And I read something like calcium was around 100 parts per million or something like that. Now this is for probably like some specific species of plant, but I wonder if, there is that same amount of calcium in the San Luis Obispo water, right? For example. So on the surface, like maybe that's actually a good amount to be in there, right? But maybe when it's paired with the high TDS, it's not, maybe there's some other damaging component to the plant, like salt stress, and it can't take up water or something like that. Or maybe, that calcium doesn't get absorbed into the plant because it's competing with other things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like it's blinded by the other stuff that's in there.
Yeah. But it also says to me, like, potentially, I was also really interested to see that calcium was, in general, available in much higher amounts than magnesium in tap water.
Mm-hmm.
They're both labeled as, like, secondary macronutrients. So, I have no idea what the actual, like, ratio of those two that the plant needs. So that would be an interesting thing to study is, like, is it a 3-to-1 ratio of calcium to magnesium for the plant's processes? Like, I don't know. Is it supposed to be the same and like I should be dosing magnesium? I don't know. But those are all things that kind of came up for me when I was looking at these parameters.
Yeah, that's a great question, because then like we don't have, like you can't go look at the fertilizer to see like what it was because it didn't have any calcium.
Because it didn't have any, yeah. Maybe we should, maybe I should
was
find a fertilizer that has it. Well, I think there's actually a very easy answer to this. There's a supplement used often called CalMag, which is calcium and magnesium.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
sorry.
I wonder what the elemental. I actually have it here somewhere. I could find it, but we could see like what is the ratio in that, right? That could give us a pretty good.
That's true.
While we're chatting, I'll see if I can find the package instructions. Okay, so I just found it very quick. For one, for example, and I don't know if this is indicative of all of them, but it's 3.2% calcium and 1.2% magnesium. So roughly like a 3-to-1 ratio. Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe the reason that a lot of fertilizers don't have these is like those parameters tend to, in US water at least, have, ratios in a similar amount. I haven't looked at like what the actual instructions are. It says, okay, 1 teaspoon per gallon of water. I'd have to do the math on like, how much parts per million that is, but maybe we can do that before the podcast ends. But okay, another thing to look into. Very interesting to kind of
give me a lot of credit doing math in the middle of a podcast. I don't know. We'll see.
No worries. Okay, so I would have to give you the bulk density, I think, too. Otherwise, well, actually, no. I guess 1 teaspoon. You have the volume and the percentage. So as long as it's percentage by volume. Okay. So interesting. Oh, and it also says on this CalMag, adjust the pH to 6.2 to 7. So I think that's further evidence of like, at least these people making these fertilizers think that, the absorption of these chemicals is best in that 6.2 to 7 range. Alrighty. So thank you for gathering all that data. That was really helpful. I'm really curious to hear kind of folks, listeners like reactions to all those different parameters.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to do beyond this, we've talked about all these different parameters, what amounts are meaningful. We've had some very kind of philosophical debates about these different parameters. What I wanted to talk about was getting it a little bit more real now and going back to like, okay, you just found out that, hey, maybe I should take a look if my tap water TDS is at 700 and consider treating. Where do you go from there? So I would love to talk with you based on your experience with water treatment. Like, what are some different systems that people can implement at their home? And maybe we can kind of like pick some of these scenarios to kind of, break away at and design a system for.
I think that might be a good idea, is maybe like a tiered sort of like treatment solution, like, or maybe like a 3 different sort of scenario type thing. Because I think what you will need to treat for is going to vary depending on your water source, and the solution to achieve what you need is going to be different depending on what that water source is. So I think having kind of a little breakout of a few different scenarios here to talk through what it might look like is a good idea.
Yeah. So let's maybe start with kind of high alkalinity, high TDS. So that was the main problems that we kind of think there are for these bad waters like Slow and San Jose and Phoenix. So what would you do if you had high alkalinity, high total dissolved solids water based on what we've kind of talked about today?
Well, like you had said, or like somebody had said, the ubiquitous they, you want the pH to be in that 6.2, 6.5 to 7 range, slightly acidic. And so if you have high TDS, high alkalinity, you may want to acidify. But we had already talked about that when you have high TDS, you're not really eliminating any of that TDS by adding the acid. You probably are going to have to dose a bunch of acid to affect the pH in the way that you want if you have high alkalinity. So then the other option would be to like remove the TDS, remove the stuff that's in there, and then like maybe remineralize or something. Like a reverse osmosis type system, like really get everything out of the water that's in there and then add back in exactly what you're trying to add. And I think based on how you had set it up earlier, the acidification seems like not that effective. And so if I were in that scenario, I'm probably going to bite the bullet and want to go with the reverse osmosis and really have the control over what I'm putting in again.
So can you, and no worries if you're actually not familiar with these systems, but what even is reverse osmosis? Like, what are these systems? I know a little bit from my my freshwater and saltwater hobby, but I haven't actually looked into like how these membranes work and things like that. But yeah,
it's what's the phrase that I used in the last podcast? You're stretching my knowledge. No
worries.
But I was really searching for the word membrane, and that was about as far as I was going to get with.
Okay, no stress at all. I mean, high
pressure, lots of pumping costs, very small holes to only let water through.
Okay.
Concentrate stream on the other side of all the stuff that didn't go through the membrane, and you do have to process that. But in a home system, that's kind of like containerized, and it's kind of like changed out with as kind of a cartridge, like with the membrane, like the concentrate stream, the residual stuff that isn't the clean water, the reject. Like that, I believe, is like held, like containerized within the RO system, so that when you're changing out the membrane periodically as part of the routine maintenance, that reject stream goes with the old membrane. I don't know how all that works. I don't build any of those systems. I don't know any of that. So I'm just kind of talking from what I'm guessing at. Okay. But that's the long and short of it. It's a membrane. You need a lot of pressure, pumping costs to get just the water through these very small holes in the membrane, and the other stuff gets rejected, kind of pushed away. Makes
sense. The systems that I'm familiar with from saltwater hobby have they're rated for some kind of like 75 gallons per hour or something like that, right? They've got different flow rate ratings, and they're made to work on the pressure that's coming out of your hose, right? I don't know what the hose pressure usually is, but let's say it's like 30 psi, something like that, right? For regular home water tap, right? You go out to your garden and you turn the tap and then you water your plants, right? So a reverse osmosis system, I've usually seen that there are multiple stages. You can get anywhere from like 3, well, I guess you can even go, I've seen ones with 1 stage, right? There's 1 membrane versus there's like multiple components. Like you might have a 3-stage system, for example, might be reverse osmosis membrane and then a inline, or maybe sediment filter is first and then reverse osmosis and then a carbon filter or something like that, right? So each of those is targeted at removing a different thing from the water.
Yeah.
So the sediment gets out like big particles. The reverse osmosis gets out, a lot of the dissolved stuff that's bigger than water molecules, and then, but not 100% of it. And then the carbon filter maybe gets out chlorine or something like that, right?
Yeah. If I were setting up the
Inorganic.
system, I would have it with the RO being last.
Okay.
Just because, like you said, exactly right. The sediment filter would go first, and that's basically to protect the membrane in the RO. Like you want to protect the expensive stuff with the cheap stuff. Is like kind of how in my head that works, because that's the way that a water treatment plant is set up. Also, like the carbon, the activated carbon is like it's one of the more expensive filter media that you can get, like in water treatment, like sand, gravel, anthracite, other stuff like that. Activated carbon is on a dollar per pound basis one of the more like unit cost expensive media, but it's always like by that virtue, it's like the tail on the dog. It's one of the last treatment steps in the treatment train, because you want to have the least load on that. You want to change that out the least often to minimize your cost. And so I would imagine in a home system, it's the same sort of thing. You'd have sediment filter getting out any residual solids in there so that you're not clogging up or damaging the RO membranes. The carbon would get dissolved organics so that you're not, again, overloading, you're minimizing the load to the RO membrane. And then all the dissolved solids that the carbon wouldn't pick up, because it's not bound with some sort of organic substrate, the RO is going to pick that up as kind of the last stage in that little under sink treatment system. So yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. The thing that kind of sucks for RO systems, for Bonsai at least, in my experience, is that the flow rate is pretty low out of these systems typically, right? So you're getting like this little like, dinky stream coming out of the thing. So you can't like water with it in line in your hose always. I've seen 1-stage systems that you can. I haven't tested how effective those are, but maybe they're great. But for the 3-stage systems, at least, like you have to, like run it for an hour and get 75 gallons of water or whatever. And then you in a tub, which is, your low TDS water. And then you have a pump in there that you have connected, like a submersible pump that you have connected to your hose. And then you water with that kind of reservoir of water, right? So
yeah,
it's definitely an extra step. And it's, you got to have this big, like, garbage can sized tub of water, right? And you have to think in advance. You can't just walk out and water. You have to have had this tub built up. So, I think the system's fairly straightforward. There's lots of great examples online, but it does come with an extra cost, right? Both in like there's wastewater. It might be like a 5-to-1 ratio of like good water to bad water comes out of the system, right? The effluent, like the bad water, you put into your non-important plants or something. I don't know. There's probably a way to recycle it, but so that's what I've seen for those kind of RO systems that work pretty well. The thing to call out is, if you're familiar with like fish keeping, we often use a DI stage as well, a deionization. And that takes your water from maybe coming out of the RO membrane, you have 30 or 40 TDS. With DI, it's totally deionizing the water. So this will take your TDS down to 0. So you'll get pure water. I actually don't think you need that in Bonsai, because we've kind of determined that actually having low concentrations of these like calcium carbonates and magnesium is giving calcium and magnesium to the plant, which is important. And so we've seen the other waters have this 40 to 80 TDS for the good waters. So I don't think it's important to add a DI stage. I think it actually harms you, because then you have to re-add these minerals as opposed to getting them. So it's an interesting thing that like you actually don't need to go that like step further. It can actually be harmful. And so you can actually just use the reverse osmosis stages, like those 3 initial stages, or a 1-stage RO membrane, and get similar results.
Yeah, you don't need to get all the way to 0.
Yep. Okay, I think that kind of outlines that scenario. Do you know of any other ways to do that we're missing in the hobby? Like that's that kind of 3-stage system connected to a tap and then pumping into a reservoir is what I've seen in the past, but
Not
I don't
really.
know if we're
No,
missing something.
the multi-stage, like multi-unit op, is kind of the like if you're trying to treat water like in your own home, that's usually you're going to need multiple things depending on what you're trying to do exactly. But for that scenario, the sediment filter, the carbon filter, and then RO filter, like that's a pretty common like treatment train, like at least conceptually in water treatment, that's pretty familiar to people. I can't really think of any like big like there are probably variations on that. Like you could probably mix and match other filter media in with activated carbon, like for maybe someone does a carbon bed also with a like an ion exchange resin in there. There are variations on that, but that's kind of the main one that stuck out to me.
Okay. The next scenario I wanted to talk through was the high pH, low alkalinity scenario. So my pH is high and not in the right range. This is similar to my SF water actually, but the alkalinity, the buffering capacity is low. Maybe I'll kind of go first on this one and I'm interested in your thoughts, see if I'm too kind of pigeonholed into this, but this is kind of like potentially a post RO water scenario or, just your base water in somewhere like San Francisco. So what I do is instead of acidifying, I acidify like with a specific like pH up or pH down, sorry, like some kind of acid. I acidify with my fertilizer, and that seems to do pretty well for me. I think you could also, and like how I do that is I have a tub of concentrate of inorganic fertilizer mixed into like at a very high ratio, and then I have an injection system, so called a dosatron. So as water flows through my hose, the kind of pressure in this mechanical system pulls up concentrate into the hose stream and it mixes together, obviously. And so it's just in line with the hose essentially.
Yeah.
And that works pretty well for me. You could also use that same system, that bucket of concentrate of acids plus water. I would just, my thought though is like if you're gonna be setting up this injection system and acidifying your water, why not just microdose fertilizer at the same time? Because fertilizer is also going to reduce the pH. So something to think about for folks. Like, yeah, I would measure the pH though of your fertilizer plus water to see if it actually is affecting the pH enough to get you into the range that you want.
That's what I was gonna hit on is that do you think that there is like maybe not based on your answer, but do you think that there would be a benefit to reducing the pH before you try to mix in the fertilizer? Like, would it then be more like is the stuff like you're getting
effective?
some residual drop in pH? Do you think you would stuff be more soluble in the whatever, I assume it's a powder or whatever it is for the fertilizer? Would it be more soluble if the pH was lowered first? Like, are you missing out on some marginal gain in effectiveness of the fertilizer in that way? I don't know that answer, and I don't think it's particularly likely based on what you're describing. You're already getting, you're going to affect the pH of the water, but I'm just wondering if you would see some different effect or if you would get some marginal increase by acidifying before you're adding the fert.
I don't think on solubility of the Miracle Grow, like these inorganic things, their concentrations are way below the solubility limit of the water.
Fair enough.
For these components. So we're not packing a ton of stuff into this water, right? It's still fairly low concentrations. So I don't think we're precipitating out a bunch of these inorganic things. I think it's more I'm less worried about the solubility of the fertilizer in the water and more worried about the ability for the plant to uptake the nutrients based on the pH around its roots, right? So, yep, it's a good question though. I don't know. I guess if you were in the situation where you had high pH, high alkalinity, but low TDS, which I don't know, maybe that does exist. I don't know. Then I haven't seen any water ports like that, but it could totally exist. Then maybe that's a great scenario to acidify. Or if you're really seeing, you acidify and you see really great results, or maybe you don't want to use inorganic fertilizer, right? Maybe you don't want to use a liquid soluble fertilizer. Then you have to acidify and then you use your organic stuff on the soil, right? So, which the organic stuff will affect the pH as well, right? It's just happening after you water versus with the water before it's added to the mixture. But yeah, I think it's something to keep in mind that like fertilizer is going to acidify your water. I guess if you really firmly believe that you shouldn't be microdosing, like you should just water or you should just fertilize once a month or something, then maybe you'd need to acidify. All right. The last scenario I wanted to kind of call out was if you have zero TDS water. So maybe you're using rainwater or I don't know if rainwater has zero TDS. I think do
I
you know?
imagine it would I don't know if it has none. I mean, I can look it up and see what the interwebs say, but I would imagine that it probably has some.
Yeah, I would think so too, because there's stuff dissolved and like it's probably running off of your roof or whatever, right? And it's going to pick
Yeah.
up stuff there. So probably not zero, but maybe you're using RODI water. I mean, I guess my suggestion would be don't, but I think what we found is that it probably makes sense to add some of these components like fertilizer and then calcium and magnesium into your water. I guess this is like a hydroponic situation, right? And
Hmm.
from that industry, we know that they add these components manually, right? So just something to think about, like if you have zero TDS water, you probably do need to add a lot of these different essential nutrients into your water as you water, right? Otherwise, the plant isn't getting those nutrients. So just something to call out.
Right on.
All right, this was actually a blast. I had a lot of fun talking through this with you, so I appreciate you taking the time. Any kind of final thoughts that you want to leave folks with? Or like one thing for sure I'd love to hear is like, to you, where's the next area for research? What's the like open question that this created for you?
Okay, so the one open question I think that I was most interested in was the functions of each of the macro and micronutrients in the plants, and maybe that's like a project for me to just like look stuff up about that because that's just kind of my own like niche interest. But that was something that's interesting to me, like that there is some logic in all these fertilizers behind the proportions of each of these things, not only just for the uptake of the plant but for the actual like well-being of the plant, and so they serve some sort of function in the plant's physiology, and I have no idea what that is. So learning about that would be pretty cool. I think the other point is just being continuing, like I just want to say to people to be curious about stuff. When I was like first trying to get into hobbies in general, like I would not want to, like I would think everything was too monumental a challenge for me to want to tackle. And so like being willing to try something, I think is just a really useful like just life skill to have, just be willing to just give it a shot. And I hope that our last two conversations, and particularly this one, will give people the, maybe not the know-how, but the confidence to give something a try that they haven't before.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, I guess kind of summarizing a few things that I kind of took out of this episode. One was, you know, the concentration of some of these elements like calcium and magnesium, especially, and just the general total dissolved solids in our water is a meaningful amount. So we need to be careful about what our parameters are, and not all tap water is suitable for bonsai growth, especially across all species, right? So that was the first thing. The second thing was some fertilizers don't include calcium and magnesium. So, but our water often does include calcium and magnesium. So something to be interested. I thought that was interesting that maybe somebody was thinking, and they were designing these fertilizers in the context of the irrigation water that most people use. So that was interesting to me, and I thought was an interesting kind of conundrum. The next thing was just that a lot of the micronutrients are not really available in amounts in our tap water that are relevant to the plant. And then definitely nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are not even close, right? There's like parts per billion of those, and they're needed in the like 750 to 250 parts per million range. That was a big call out. And then the last thing that I'm really curious about, and I kind of got on a high horse about, is I think that we need to be cognizant of how the calcium carbonate, the alkalinity, the hardness in our water is impacting the soil pH over time. My kind of theory is that with high alkalinity, you're essentially adding lime to your bonsai soil substrate over time, and the alkalinity will raise. So I think that could be one of the reasons that we see plants do poor with kind of some of these San Luis Obispo and other water. I'm wrecking them. I'm sorry. Phoenix, you're next. With some of these waters that have high alkalinity, I think part of that is that it raises the pH of the soil over time and can lock out certain nutrients. The other part, I think, which probably is the even bigger contributor, is high TDS means less of the beneficial nutrients make it to the plant. Like there's more competition for uptake of ions into the plant. And I think that TDS is like, if I was going to look at one parameter, that's what I would look at. So that's kind of my summary of the conversation today.
It was a good one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric, for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Maybe we'll see how this episode goes with folks, and maybe we'll get ourselves into trouble with some more research in the future. But thank you again for taking the time, and this was a blast. So really always enjoy talking with you.
Glad to be here. Thanks to you and your audience for having me. Appreciate it.
All righty, have a good night.
All right, you too.